Hey everybody, I'm back. We're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution again in the United States. In the part one video, we really talked about the Industrial Revolution in the United States as it happened before the Civil War. Uh, this video, we'll talk about the Industrial Revolution as it happened after the Civil War. So, if you recall, uh, the pace of the Industrial Revolution was primarily before the Civil War. It was primarily concentrated in the North, uh, textile mills. We talked about Morse code. We talked about the sewing machine. We talked about a few different inventions that came along prior to the Civil War. But after the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution really takes off. They would say at a breakneck pace, very fast. We never really set down a definition for the Industrial Revolution, which I imagine is kind of important, given that that's the whole topic of the videos. So, an industrial revolution is that it's the transformation or the change from an agriculture or a farming based lifestyle to an industrial or a manufacturing based lifestyle. So, the picture you might put in your head prior to the Industrial Revolution maybe is a farm field and a farm. And, families working on the farm, they're producing everything that they need. After the Industrial Revolution, scenes like this, city scenes and manufacturing plants, might be more common. And here's what the map looked like in the United States after the Civil War. You can see we have a lot of our states, but still, if you go out into the West, you can see you have a lot of territories. These are areas they've not gone through the steps yet to become states. They're not very populated. It's sometimes odd to me to look to see that California, Oregon, Nevada became states prior to this middle section becoming states, but that's the way it was. One thing that really helped with the industrial movement is the railroads. If you recall, I showed you the map of the railroad network prior to the Civil War. Most of it was concentrated in the North, which really gave the North an advantage during the Civil War. There was some rail in the South, but there was no rail that went west. All right, and people wanted to go west. The land out here was cheap. There were a lot of people going out to try to make it rich. There was a gold rush, so people wanted to get to California. So they would take a train to St. Louis, and then they would a locomotive train, and then they would get on a wagon, and they'd take a wagon west. So it would take people more than like 6 months to go from the east to the west. Well, when you put the train in, now that 6 months becomes like 6 days. And it's important too for industrialization because factories, they need natural resources. If you're going to build, if you're going to make things, you have to have the natural resources. So if you take a look at this resource map here, you can see what kind of resources were available in the West. And you can see there's a whole lot of oil out here. There's gold. So there's a lot out here. There's coal too. There's a lot out here that a growing nation needs, but you have to be able to get to it. And one thing the Transcontinental Railroad did is it gave a way to get people to West and transport natural resources, things that come from the land, back to the East to the factories where they could use it. So a couple important factors: railroads to get to the natural resources, but then you have to have people to work. You have people to work in the factories. So this was a time where we had a whole lot of immigrants come into the country. Let's see, 14 million immigrants between 1860 and 1900 come into this country. Most of them came through Ellis Island, and that's what this picture over here is. I think this picture's from around 1900, but you can see they're packed on this ship, and they're coming to the United States through New York, which is where Ellis Island is. And they wanted a better life. They want the opportunities that they heard might be available to them in America, and America needs them. America needs people to work in their factories to help build the country up. Now, these guys over here on the other side, on the right, they're actually Chinese. Uh, Chinese were very important when we're talking about the transcontinental railway. They were very important workers. Uh, they came, they helped build the railroad. It's in some railroad building companies, they uh, consisted like of 90% of the workforce. So we had to have them. They came in through the West Coast. If you think of where the Pacific is at, the Pacific Ocean, and where Asia is at, it makes sense. They came in through the West Coast. Unfortunately, uh, towards the end of the, let's see, 19th century, there was a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment out there because they would come to the United States and they would work for these super low wages and they would send all the wages home, right, to help out their families. And people resented this. People who were trying to provide for their own families who had been in the country resented this. Does this sound familiar to anybody? Because this is a process that we go through in this country all the time when we have these conversations about immigration um, and illegal immigration. It's oftentimes really what the underlying tone message is. It's about jobs. All right. So these people were coming in. The Chinese people were coming in. They were undercutting wages and they were taking jobs. Now, some of the railroads actually really preferred to have Chinese workers because at this time there's a gold rush going on, and their non-Chinese workers will work on the railroad for a while, then suddenly head off and try to make it rich, finding gold. Uh, most accounts that I've read said that the Chinese workers were actually very good workers. They worked hard and they didn't leave to go off in search of gold. But anyways, there's this anti-Chinese sentiment that comes along because they're taking our jobs. All right. So what happens is that they pass a Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which means essentially that they won't let the Chinese come in to work, skilled labor, or even unskilled labor. They won't let them come in and work. Of course, the Chinese government doesn't like this because, they like to be able to send their people someplace to work. And it sounds like you're excluding them, because of their race and you're saying that they're inferior. But this Exclusion Act remains in effect all the way up until like the 1940s. They just wouldn't let them. They wouldn't let them migrate to the United States. A lot of people made it rich. They would call these guys who formed these industries industrialists. One of them was this guy by the name of Andrew Carnegie. You've probably heard the name Carnegie before because, well, he had a lot of money and he did a lot of things with this money. When I think of the Man of Steel, I think of Superman, right? But the true Man of Steel back in the day when steel was just being introduced into the United States was Andrew Carnegie. He took a process that he borrowed from England. Does this sound familiar? Because you remember Slater the trader who brought over the milling process, the cotton mill, the textile industry to make mills run in this country. Well, he borrowed something called the Bessemer process, and I think I'm probably saying that wrong. He brought that over from England or borrowed it from England, and it allowed him to create steel that was much faster and much stronger. His first job when he came to the United States is kind of interesting too, because he worked in a mill, in a cotton mill. He and his father did. And then he moved on and eventually got a job in a telegraph company. He was sending telegraphs, and it makes me think back to Morris in our previous video. And in fact, at one point during the Civil War, he becomes appointed, and he's in charge of all the telegraph lines in the eastern part of the United States. But anyways, he makes his money in steel, and he builds these steel towns, and he controls all the elements of production, which is to say he controls the railroads. So, shipping resources in and shipping, the finished product out. He's not going to have any problems there because he takes over the railroads. He takes over some of the industries that provide the raw materials for the steel industry. So he's very smart. He ends up making, probably billions of dollars, certainly in today's standards, billions of dollars during his lifetime, and he sells out to a guy by the name of J.P. Morgan. You might have heard of him too. But then he spends the last part of his life just giving away his money and to like charitable causes. He's like, yeah, I've got more than I can spend. What can I do? Which is why we hear his name so often, because he started universities. He built public works. He funded libraries. They say in the last 18 years of his life, he gave away $350 million. In today's dollars, that's around $5 billion. So he gave away a lot of things. Now, he dominated the steel industry, but he didn't monopolize it. That's something entirely different. And we'll talk about a monopoly. So a monopoly is when one person or seller controls an entire market or all the goods in a market. Probably could have said that better. Anyways, it's up there, and we'll cover it later. But Carnegie didn't control the entire steel market. He controlled a big chunk of it, but not all of it. Generally, when someone has monopoly, they control everything. They control all the goods. So what happens when you can control all the goods? What are some of the side effects? What's the effect of that when somebody controls all the goods? So let's think of it this way. We used to play a lot of Monopoly at my house, but I kept getting beat really bad. My son would always get these corner properties, right? And the idea in Monopoly is to buy as many, at least in my opinion, is to buy as many properties as you can, because the more properties you have, the more rent you can charge, right? So he'd always get these corner properties. I would land on them and go bankrupt. And then, when his mom would land on them, he'd give her some sweetheart deal. Anyways, never mind that. But let's think about it in terms of maybe, I don't know, number 2 pencils. No, wait, that's not a very good one. Let's talk about it in terms of Chromebooks. Imagine for a second that you create all the Chromebooks. What would be the advantage to you if you create all the Chromebooks? Well, the advantage is you essentially get to set your price. If there's no competition, there's no one to come in and offer that product at a lower price. So when someone has a monopoly, they control the market. They control how much is produced, and they control the price. And if you can control the price and how much is produced, you can make a lot of money. Now, there's one guy that comes along who actually has a monopoly. And that guy is John D. Rockefeller. He has a monopoly in oil. He's kind of an interesting story in that he also gets his start in the Telegraph. One of his first jobs was in the Telegraph, too. But anyways, he starts up in Cleveland. And he's selling goods, but he comes into this development of oil, and the oil fields are in western Pennsylvania, and Cleveland is the closest shipping port to the western Pennsylvania oil wells. Now, oil back in these days is used for a lot of things. When I think of oil now, I think of gasoline. But oil has a whole lot of different other uses. You can take oil and turn it into a lot of different things, not just gasoline. So anyways, he buys one oil refinery, which pumps the oil out of the ground and turns it into things, useful things like gasoline, like lubricants, things like that. He takes one, and then he takes a look around the industry, and he sees how incredibly inefficient the industry is. You can make some pretty good money in the industry, and what happens is people come in who don't have a lot of money. They just have a little bit of money, and depending on the price of kerosene, which they use to fuel lamps, they can make some pretty decent money if the kerosene market is up. So they go in, they make some money, they undercut prices, and eventually they drive themselves out of business, and they drive down the entire industry. So he starts to think, well, what if I start buying all these oil refineries? Is what he does. So he ends up buying oil refineries all over the United States. And at one point, he gets up to 90%. He owns 90% of the oil refineries. He also starts to control all the railroads that ship his products. All right. So monopolies, generally governments try to guard against them because they're not good for the consumer. And that's what happened here, too. So the government came in and said, well, you actually have a monopoly. He set up these trusts with multiple people running a whole lot of companies, like 9 people running a whole lot of companies. And the government comes in and says, well, you have to break this up. They broke up the monopoly. But by that time, John Rockefeller, he'd made billions as well. All right. So we've got these industrialists, Carnegie Mellon, John Rockefeller, who make a whole bunch of money building up these industries. There are some other people that come around that you probably know about who make these inventions that also help fuel the Industrial Revolution. Alexander Graham Bell. It's no mistake that the phone companies used to be called Ma Bell, the Bell companies. Right? He invented the telephone. And he also had worked with telegraphs, and he was like, wow, I mean, that's the electronic impulse from place to place. That's nice. But what if people could actually hear each other? You could hear somebody's voice. So he comes up with this idea to invent the telephone. And that's an early prototype of the telephone. A prolific inventor comes along too during this time frame by the name of Thomas Edison. And you've probably heard about Thomas Edison. If I asked you what Thomas Edison did, many of you would, maybe say he invented the light bulb, and that's not really true. He improved the technology for the light bulb, and the light bulb went from lasting from like 40 hours to like 1,500 hours. So the light bulb was this good idea. It would allow you to work at night, but it just 40 hours, it wasn't that cost efficient. So he comes along and makes this light bulb that will go for 1,500 hours. And what he did is he changed the filament, the threads that are inside the light bulb, so they would last longer. I don't know how he did it. I mean, the guy was a lot smarter than me. He was super smart. As far as inventions go, he came up with over 1,000 inventions. You file a patent when you come up with the invention. And he actually formed this research park in his hometown, I think, and where a team of scientists would work on inventions all the time. Now, he came up with some kind of wacky inventions too. One of the inventions that he came up with, and I think he might have got it patent. I don't know if he did or not. Maybe he didn't, since it didn't work. But anyways, he said he had a way to bring back the dead. And he was doing it through electromagnetic fields or something of that sort. Anyways, it didn't work. But that's one of the oddball ideas among a whole lot of great ideas that he came up with. So anyways, when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, we're moving from that whole farming economy to a manufacturing economy. It impacted how people live. I mean, you can take a look at these pictures. The scene on the right, they're working inside a factory. They're not working in a farm field. They're not sewing their own shirts. They're working in a factory. These kids over here they were called the Breaker Boys, and what the Breaker Boys did is that they worked in coal mines, and they would sort coal, and they would try to by hand sort out the imperfections. A lot of times they'd be pulling slate out of the coal, so they'd work in this cramped space, and they would do that all day. And these were kids, and that's another thing that happened with the Industrial Revolution. Not only men went to work in the factories, but women and children went to work in the factories too. There's going to be a pushback on all this in a little bit, because sometimes the working conditions aren't very good. Guys like Carnegie Mellon and John Rockefeller are making boatloads of money, but some of these people down here aren't doing so well. And particularly, these new immigrants that came into the country that we talked about, they're pretty much just being taken advantage of. It also, of course, impacted where people live. You're not living in the country anymore. You're coming into the city. And, because a whole lot of people came into the city at one time, and because they didn't have a whole lot, they were immigrants, this kind of housing was set up, and it was, kind of like, I don't know, for lack of a better word, it was slum housing. It was cramped. The housing wasn't very good. Maybe there's not even plumbing inside. There's not good sanitation in the cities. It's cramped inside. So the Industrial Revolution, has this huge impact on the United States. It's putting a lot of people into factories. It's putting a lot of people to work. It's bringing a lot of people to the United States. But some of these people are not are not living their best lives. Okay, they have a hard life. They're not making fun. These breaker boys back here again, they're making like 45 cents a day, and they're working all day in the dark, not even allowed to wear gloves. So what comes out of this is this kind of like a union, a labor movements where people's rights are protected. And we'll talk about that hopefully next week.